seen man before. No, of course you haven't, for you're much too good, I'm sure.
All the best horror is psychological. It takes fears and dreams, things we usually struggle to articulate at all, and teases them out into exaggerations and distortions that clarify and intensify the original feelings. Here are two extremely similar horror franchises that both take the foundational truth of horror and make it into the explicit frame of the whole piece. In The Evil Within, a detective gets pulled into a world of the imagination where people's memories and dreams mingle to make a realm of actual nightmares. In Alan Wake, a horror writer is compelled by a demon to come up with a novel that will empower and unleash the demon by coming true, unless Alan can sneak in his own ending to the story and save his wife. Either way, the enemy in both cases is the imagination itself, its depth, its ferocity, its disregard for the order that satisfies the other senses. Both game series hinge on a kind of malleable reality, where you're never sure if the next time you go through a door, it'll open on the same when and the same where you were in when you stepped through the door in the first place. All four of these games, on a technical level, are tremendously similar third-person survival horror titles all, with an emphasis on scarcity and disorientation. But the devil is in the details. None of these games, even within their series, rely on exactly the same presentation, despite all their many surface and stylistic similarities. It's not enough to simply be gory or to be dim. There's a certain quality of tension that has to be there. It has to actually be somehow scary to qualify as a horror game. Doom 3 is a horror game, for example. It's all about being alone and hunted in the echoing darkness, but the recent Doom reboot is not. In that game, you're the hunter, and the primary emotion is a kind of savage glee. You can have a moody, dark aesthetic and still not be a horror game. Think back, if you can, on Zork Nemesis. It's still an adventure game, an environmental puzzler primarily. Its primary driver is curiosity. But all four of these games that we're talking about now are true blue bona fide horror games. Their action and narrative are driven by fear. The games are succeeding at their goals when the player is in a state of suggestible anxiety, when they have no confidence at all in their ability to keep going and not be imminently torn apart by something grotesque. Think about the last time you were alone in the woods at night, even if it was just venturing out to take a midnight piss on a camping trip. Think about the quiet. You're aware of each sound and how each sound carries. The wind will sway the branches of the trees in front of you, but only the ones your flashlight illuminates. There's more beyond. There's always more beyond. The woods go on forever in the shadow, and you can never know for certain what's watching you back, only that, whatever's out there, it's craftier and quieter and sharper than you. We call that recreation today, but the other thing is that that is the majority of human history. Alone in the woods, hunted and cold. Something deep in the brain remembers, and to play these kinds of games is to reach deep into those ancient places and scratch an itch, to stick a digital needle right into the center of flight or fight, and light that center of the brain up like a Christmas tree. It feels wonderful. If the truth of horror is that, for the most part, it's all in the mind, the paradox of that is that horror works because the mind is equal parts revulsed by these ideas of blood and danger, and shockingly hungry for the opportunity to confront these monsters and come out the other side alive. Another thing both series share is a real self-consciousness about the themes and tropes of horror media, and a kind of a deliberate engagement with the cliches of the genre. I want to start with Alan Wake because it's the more deliberate of the two on that front. Alan Wake, the protagonist, starts off by throwing out a Stephen King quote pretty much right off the bat in the opening narration. The quote is, "Nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear." In theory, this is very true. Horror is accomplished in small gestures and details, moments where something's amiss in the environment or a character's life elicits deeper anxiety from the reader or watcher or player. The history of a demonic presence is just exposition. The suggestion of one in shadows and dust is horror. In practice, this quote is professional permission for some really goofy shit. Although the entire game is relentlessly wound around the idea that Alan Wake is a writer, he is, even by admission of the plot, kind of a shitty one. Wake is famous for writing a run of trashy, hard-boiled detective novels and has just killed off his main character in hopes it will free him to do something more creative. You know, exactly like Paul Sheldon and his Misery novels in the Stephen King story. Alan Wake feels very much like a character in a Stephen King story, not only because King is so irritatingly fond of making his main characters writers themselves, but also because those writers are often such egotistical doofuses, and Alan Wake is nothing if not kind of a doofus. Alan Wake the game would be an awful book because it's centered around a bad writer's iffy slapdash novel coming to life. The meta-level points would be lost in the fact that it's almost an impossible tightrope to walk to write a good book about a bad one. It would be a bad TV series, even though it's arranged into 8 roughly hour-long episodes, because it's by nature rather rote and repetitive and simple. Alan Wake shined his flashlight on the monster, then he shot it, and then he walked to the next scene. But this is a game. It is okay that Alan Wake is a bad writer because no writing will be accomplished. It is okay that a late game moment resembles an early game moment because the tension is fresh each time. The monsters advance, and you have just enough or maybe not enough equipment and time to hold them off. For a little while, anyway. Until they come again. True to the quote, this is never examined in exhaustive detail. The creatures are A, definitely Alan's, and B, definitely dangerous, so he just kinda goes from there. The game leans heavily into the player's dramatic expectations of what regularly happens in a horror story by playing the cliches straight, telegraphing through level design and foreshadowing when to worry and when to relax. You see, it was advantageous of Alan Wake the writer to put in so many cliches into his story because that genre familiarity becomes a weapon with which you fight the creatures. They behave like mindless monsters. They behave like you might expect. You can tell when an ambush is coming because it just looks like it ought to. Awareness of the tropes being used in the narrative becomes a situational, tactical awareness to use in the game's combat. So while the story itself, just as a story, screams airport paperback, its use of the medium transforms the context of the cliché into something much more clever. Alan Wake the game does have a knack for miming the flourishes of big-budget television, though. Its color palette is muted, giving everything a lens-filtered look while accentuating light sources like neon and fire. Light is the most powerful weapon in the game. It burns the protective shadow off of the figures attacking you so you can go pew-pew with the more boring weapons and put the nightmares down. Until the shadow is gone, though, they can't really be harmed, but they sure as hell can harm you. This is actually a pretty genius mechanic that makes all the horror run smoothly, the oil in its mood engine. Firstly, it gives the monsters 2 ways of unnerving the player, as far-off shadows, indistinct but advancing with a deliberate menace, and then closer as detailed freaks who throw up their hands to shield themselves from your light. The vague threat, and then whenever the player hits them with a flashlight beam, a specific threat. You'll see 1 or 2 in the darkness, but come to find out there's actually 4 or 5 in the yard with you. You'll focus your light on the big hulking one in front of you, but still be aware on your periphery of the smaller and faster figures darting through the underbrush. The flashlight allows you to be frightened during combat in multiple ways of multiple things, all fluidly in control of the players themselves. The way flares pop off in their toxic pink glow and make all the figures scamper and hide from the light is addictive. The flares make you feel powerful. It lets you narrowly avoid death, but the flare soon fades, and the monsters are still there. It doesn't actually solve your problem, powerful as it is. Later on, you get police flashbang grenades, which disintegrate the monsters, but these are limited and given to you for some situations where you face an endlessly respawning amount of the creatures, so you simply have to clear a path through them and run. The flashlight also slows the advance of the creatures, leading to a consistent tension where you can't possibly have enough time to stop them all before they reach you, so you have to spend lots of time whittling them down and then running blind through the foggy night. Alan Wake is so simple in its big ideas, light versus dark, creator versus creation, mouse 2 to aim and mouse 1 to shoot, that the intensity of how satisfyingly it all comes together is kinda shocking. Alan Wake is, by virtue of its medium, so much better than it ought to be, than it would be in a passive medium. It's a case study for the power of active storytelling, where the person being told the story is a participant in it. Like Alan Wake, you are, for the time being, living a fictional life in someone else's creation until you save your game and get up from your chair. The game's narrative has predestination built into it. You don't get to make those decisions, they're already written. But the player's individual choreography of peril and triumph is up to them. The systems provide popcorn moments of tension, dread, release. This is structured around the cliches and borrowed motifs of the narrative, but Alan Wake is a good horror game within the microcosm of the primary gameplay loop, the 30 to 60 seconds of engagement, attack, and defense that you repeat over and over and over again for the game's 20 hours. If you've got good tension and true horror there, by virtue of the game's structure, you've probably got it everywhere. Alan Wake is distinct also for being one of the only survival horror games I've played that takes place almost entirely outdoors. There are a few here and there episodes where there's a large indoor sequence, but Alan Wake is all about the dark and the disorientation of the woods, and that makes it rather distinct among games. Claustrophobia is easier to pull off in a digital environment, and not all horror games that give up claustrophobia for the vague threat of the outdoors succeeds. Just look at Outlast 2. But Alan Wake has a couple things in the broad design going for it that really make the outdoor setting work. One is the sheer length of the individual levels, 6 in the main campaign and then 2 DLCs. Although the twists and turns of the plot are largely predictable, the amount of physical space you traverse in a given segment is generally huge. Often your goal will be in the far distance, and after a zigzagging path towards it, you're usually diverted by a complication to a completely different goal with a completely new journey. Each node on the journey is usually somewhat mundane, with the majority of storytelling done in the beginning and end of an episode, gearing up for a cliffhanger to end the chapter on. But the important part of the game, more important than the writing of this game about a writer, is how the unbroken chain of events snowballs into a real sense of progress and accomplishment. By the end of an individual episode, you've come a long damn way and survived much. Setting it in the outdoors makes that sense of scale much more present and powerful. The other choice that makes the outdoor setting stand out is the game's avoidance of gore. It's deliberately aiming for a less aggressive experience than a Resident Evil-style survival horror setting. It's going for what Netflix might call the supernatural thriller look, and part of that aesthetic is not being quite so in-your-face with the blood and the guts as most games are. Alan Wake is more interested in spooking out than grossing out. As such, the menace is consistently oppressive and vague, a murky quality to the air, deep fog, creeping darkness with the occasional oasis of a single light bulb. In a building, you can always get a grip on your immediate surroundings, even within a labyrinth. In a long and winding outdoor environment, it's harder to grasp where you're going and where you've been. The level design makes it basically impossible to actually become lost within the level, but because the level takes you on such a wild and serpentine linear journey, the feeling of being lost, the sensation of isolation and disorientation is preserved. Because the trees are used to funnel the player and stop them from going certain directions, the combat all takes place in what is functionally still close quarters. It happens quickly, it feels dangerous, and it often feels random too, like the enemies just wander out of the fog wielding axes. On the base of it, Alan Wake's enemies are very boring. They're just small-town Northwesterners with bad complexions and worse attitudes, and then occasionally rowdy, possessed objects and machinery, but the way they move and the way they visually behave, cloaked in shadow, is legitimately creepy and unsettling. Using the flashlight to keep them at bay long enough to shoot them takes all the focus. The plain design of the enemies just doesn't track much when everything is mostly an angry shadow in the dark. If there was a lot of blood, it would steal focus from what the game actually wants the player to find unsettling about its monsters. The darkness is an unstoppable force, and it issues forth as many shadowy figures as it likes. The fight against it feels increasingly dire and unwinnable. It's a pretty small thing to be one man with a single flashlight, and that's exactly where Alan Wake wants you. Small and vulnerable in the deep dark night. The problem I've got with Alan Wake the game comes from the fact that I am perpetually irritated with Alan Wake the writer. Alan Wake, the moody, whiny schlock writer who yells at his wife for being so presumptuous as to buy him a typewriter when he's got a writer's block. Alan's realization that he's kind of a jackass is part of his character arc, so it's not like the game isn't aware of it, but he's just a very dislikable yuppie protagonist for a long period of time. Considering his ultimate fate, he gets a severe comeuppance for being a jerk, but I was unsure for a long time if I was actually willing to root for a guy who kept reminding me of that song about the fella who buys a $350 pair of lampshades and then mopes about it over crab cakes. The supporting cast, though, is mostly pretty good, from a wife who's kind of bland but well voice-acted, to a small-town cop who's the only reasonable person in the whole script, to a comic relief literary agent who looks and acts exactly like the kid with the monkey from Speed Racer, but older and with more desperation. That's Barry, and like it or not, the game thinks he's a very important foil for Alan. Sometimes this is true. The only time the game actually cracked me up laughing was when Barry did a mocking impression of Alan with a cardboard cutout that was spot on. Often, though, Barry is too comic and steps on the foot of the game's tone. He's just a ridiculous person, ridiculous things happen to him, and the game is already suspending disbelief with a low tensile thread. To put it another way, both Alan and Barry are more archetypes than specific characters. Alan is an amalgamation of the kind of writer portrayed in Stephen King's stories, and not really so much someone like King himself. Barry is a goofy sidekick with a lineage going back at least to Abbott and Costello, but probably to the dawn of time. The plot complication that makes this especially interesting to me, though, is that Alan is not the only writer in the game. Many years ago, Thomas Zane was a famous writer who also fell under the spell of the thing beneath Cauldron Lake. It's Zane's cabin where Alan winds up being forced to invent the events of the plot. It's Zane's wife, whose body the darkness uses to manifest itself around town. As the game goes on, it talks about how Zane was actually a good writer, where Alan is not, that he tried to break the curse by writing himself out of the world entirely. If he was never a writer, then he can't write the story that lets the demon loose. But the fact that this leaves a lot of plot holes means that it's bad magic as well. It doesn't work for Zane. The story must make sense on some level. Towards the very end of the game, Alan finds something that's been kept for him for 80 years. It's a page of Zane's manuscript, and it describes Alan screwing up the courage to face the game's climax, a snippet that plays out exactly as described on the page, in the same way that Alan's manuscript pages describing future scenes always play out exactly that way. Zane had one last chance to fix things, by kicking the football years down the line to someone he could trust, one of his own characters. Alan himself is Zane's fiction. It's why he's so slightly boneheaded, why his work is so full of cliches. He's a writer's idea of a bad writer. It's why Alan is deadpan guy and Barry is punchline guy. They're a deliberate trope together that way. I loved this twist way more than I expected. Predestination can get a little tiresome, but adding this level of complication to it makes the plot feel unpredictable again. I have an idea where Alan Wake might be going with his climax and his story, but Thomas Zane I'd know nothing about, and I don't know what to expect from a story from him. The DLC has a snippet of conversation that undermines the idea of Thomas Zane being lead writer on the story, but it's not trustworthy enough exposition to totally refute the idea. Whether or not Thomas or Alan are in control of the narrative, however, it's themselves that they're ultimately fighting, their creativity made manifest and arrayed against them that's causing the problem. There's a great segment about halfway through where Alan winds up at a mental wellness retreat for artists, unsure if he's been there the entire time having a psychotic episode or if Dr. Hartman has some other nefarious agenda in mind. Of course it's the latter, but the game does an awfully good job of making you wonder if it is perhaps the former. Everything about Alan's journey suggests a kind of egotistical delusion. Everyone else is swallowed by darkness, and you, the only champion of light, have to save everyone? Because of your very special gift, the gift that just happens to be the core of your self-identity. And this self-identity gives you permission to run all over town, shooting people. Walking that back for a minute, you can see this as a point where it would have been completely possible for the script to veer towards the opinion that it is delusion, that Wake is a murderer having a breakdown. The tell here is the simple fact that Hartman is one of the only living characters in the game familiar with Thomas Zane. As soon as you get to the sundial with Zane's name on it, you've got your supernatural proof that you're not crazy. Even if it's all actually happening as far as the game goes, it's explicit that the demonic present takes this form and this course of action because that's what scares Alan. That people live and die because Alan needs complications for his story and he needs tension. Is the demon responsible for the deaths in town, or is Alan's imagination because he wrote in the specificities? If the world spins on Alan's words, can we hold him responsible? Stephen King himself actually tackled this one too when he, no joke, wrote himself and a near-death accident he had into the 6th and 7th of his Dark Tower novels. His characters meet him, and he defends his creative decisions to them. It's exactly as awkward as it sounds, and is, for me anyway, the stupidest damn thing in the entire 8-book Dark Tower series. But the Dark Tower books were always about King on some level anyway, with their contemplative and personal forwards and afterwards, and his insistence on joining well over half his other fiction to the series in some way, large or small. So having him weigh in on his own creation within his creation isn't 100% as out of place as it feels on the surface of it. I want to condense a little of that segment to illustrate how the creative parts of the self can feel, all on their own, monstrous. A couple terms he uses: Ka means fate and serves for a kind of predestination. Gan is a more informal word for God, and Dis stands for the forces of entropy, chaos, and despair. Anyway, on to the quote. "What happens when you make a story?" Roland inquired. "My story, for instance." "It just comes," King said. His voice had grown faint, bemused. "It blows into me. That's the good part. And then it comes out when I move my fingers. Never from the head. Comes out the navel or somewhere. There was an editor, the Could-Be Wolf, all right. Maxwell Perkins called him a divine wind chime." Then, later, under hypnosis, Roland gets King to expand a little more on that. King says, "I'm gone, or possessed by gone, I don't know which, maybe there's no difference." King began to cry, his tears were silent and horrible. "But it's not Dis. I repudiate Dis, and that should be enough, but it's not. Ka is never satisfied. Greedy old Ka, that's what she said, isn't it? What Susan Delgado said before you killed her, or I killed her, or Gon killed her. Greedy old Ka, how I hate it. Regardless of who killed her, I made her say that, for I hate it, so I do. I buck against Ka's goad, and will until the day I go to the clearing at the end of the path. And still, Ka comes to me, comes from me. I translate it, am made to translate it. Ka flows out of my navel like a ribbon. I am not Ka, I am not the ribbon, it's just what comes through me, and I hate it, I hate it!" To which Roland advises King to stop his snivelment. Here's my point. There are few horror stories that are also true. Horror media is an exercise of the imagination, and its explicit mandate is to take our ugliest anxieties and most irrational fears and then give them form and function. Rosemary's Baby is not a good horror story because Satanists frequently run HOAs. It's good because that ugly fear that the people around you actually hate you is something a lot of us feel but know better than to articulate. Hellraiser isn't scary because the guy has pins in his head, though it helps. It's scary because everyone occasionally wonders if their hedonistic impulses won't eventually lead them off a serious cliff somewhere down the line. Alan Wake is a scary game because in the primary gameplay loop, it gets the blood pumping and the mind racing, but it's a good horror story because I'm pretty sure every creative person eventually wonders if their works are something separate from and perhaps more powerful than they are as an individual person. The idea is simple, but as a game, Alan Wake can have a long and winding execution that still feels worthwhile. It's fun for Alan to fight his own imaginary monsters. It's satisfying. And as the game reaches its climax and then goes beyond, it becomes increasingly desperate and disturbing on top of it. The out that Alan left himself to actually succeed in the end was that the last page of the manuscript would be left blank in the typewriter until he was able to return with something to thwart the demon. He would meanwhile escape, live out 99.9% of the manuscript, and then break the curse when he returned and finished the other 0.1%. However, Alan frequently ruminates on the demands of genre, and one of the demands of the horror genre is that everyone can't walk away clean from the ending. If he saves his wife, if he saves the town, saving himself would break genre. It would be bad magic for breaking genre. So he writes in a swap instead. His wife is released from her prison, and he steps into the cell and closes the door on himself instead. There is an underneath to Cauldron Lake, a mere lake of raw dreaming where the demon lived. Alan Wake ends on a fantastic line, where, having saved everyone else, he reflects on this new place he finds himself trapped. It's not a lake, it's an ocean. The word ocean all garbled and sinister. Now, that would have been an excellent place to leave the game full stop, and since very few people seem to have played the DLC, it's the ending that most people are familiar with. But the DLCs find Alan lost, deeply lost within the dreamscape, within himself. The rational parts of his mind, the parts that maintain the sense of self and the desire to go on, are now fully separate from Alan's imagination, which has gone completely mad and is now actively trying to kill every part of him. Where before there was a demonic intermediary, now it's Alan versus Alan in a purely psychological battle between manic self-annihilation and grounded perseverance. I deal with depression myself, and so I was all too familiar with the kind of frenzied self-loathing on display in the antagonist Alan, who shouts at you from the television as he invents things with which to kill you. Where the main game was deliberate in hewing to a kind of organized cliché, a paperback feel. Every encounter in the DLC feels improvisational and incomplete. The creative self is spinning wildly out of control. No editing, no filter, no objective except to stamp out the pesky rational self. It's in the DLC that I actually started to care about Alan as a character. He's had this doubt and this despondency in him the whole time, and now it's really trying to kill him. Actually, properly. He's a universe away from moping in his luxury SUV. He just wants to hold on, put his mind back together, and Lord knows I respect that journey. The combat in these last two DLCs is completely different in tone as well. The creatures aren't frightening anymore. It's Alan's mania that's frightening. So the game throws more of the creatures at you at once than it ever did before. Absurd amounts of enemies, absurd amounts of bullets, an uphill battle that feels increasingly savage and impossible. Sense doesn't matter anymore, just ferocity of emotion and ferocity of imagination. And the closer Alan gets to his core self, the harder that self fights to keep him down, to keep him crazy. The pace of the combat encounters and their more arcadey design is indicative of that. As long as Alan wants to die, he's gonna do it. And it's only in negating each wave of his creativity's assault and persisting in the face of it that there's any hope for sanity, any hope for a future for poor Alan Wake. I don't know if this is especially universal, but sometimes when I'm dreaming in a lot of detail, it'll suddenly shift into something else and I'll actively wonder where the other place went, what happened with what I was trying to do or say there. Sometimes I'll wake up a little bit and then fall back into dreaming, over and over again, for hours, remembering the accumulation of little vignettes, different scenes in my mind, but feeling no control over going in and out of them. I feel exhausted and confused. It feels like I'm trapped in the dreaming, and then I'm suspicious of the real world when I wake up after feeling that way. At least up until the point that my dog bites my face, excited that I decided to start moving again. I've never seen a medium besides video games express that kind of hazy, claustrophobic dreamscape in a way that seemed authentic to how it feels. In books, an ever-shifting environment makes it hard to follow from time to time, where your mental image of the action becomes outdated and out of sync with the story if your attention wanders too much. In movies, it feels all too deliberate. Inception and Hellraiser 2 both do a pretty excellent job, but their dreamscapes help form skeletons of their narrative, and neither are as messy and nonsensical as dreamscapes often are. The Alan Wake DLC really does nail the feeling of hazy dream. It works also in part because it builds on top of the main game. You've had time to get to know the normal, whole Alan, and you've had the supernatural experience with him and his long nighttime odyssey. The DLC takes all that and jumbles it up, the mechanical pacing and the structure of encounters, all mixed up, intensified, jumbled with familiar places and themes that are mashed into this hodgepodge. Alan's mind is scattered to the four winds. It seems like it. It feels like it. It really works well. And it loops well. The game opens with a dream Alan has about a lighthouse in the darkness. In the main 6 episodes, you don't hear another word about the lighthouse, but as soon as you find your bearings in the dreamscape, as soon as you stop wandering aimlessly through memory and fear, the lighthouse appears in the horizon and you begin moving towards it just like you did in the very beginning. It was explicitly symbolic then, and it's explicitly symbolic now, but it really does work, especially because of how wicked difficult the journey is this time around. The last bit before the lighthouse is by far the longest length in between autosave checkpoints in the entire game, and you'll likely end up fending off close to 36 total of the shadowy figures on your way up. They just keep coming, relentlessly, in both waves and based on certain routes you take, for more choreographed threats. Where in the beginning, one was enough to totally do you in, here you're fighting not just what the demon mustered against you, but as many enemies as in Alan's worst nightmares of combat, which is right here, right now, made manifest. Closing the loop and reaching the lighthouse should have done the trick and been the last scene, but instead, there's another part, an extra part, in which you fight shadowy versions of everyone who helped you in the main campaign, culminating in Barry. Yes, indeed, Barry is the final boss of Alan Wake, and he has 3 stages of attack. He's quite dangerous, but it's too much. The value of fighting a negative shadow version of Barry in terms of plot and character is almost 0, and the surprise of him being the final boss is almost all comic surprise. I don't think there's a single person out there who found Spooky Barry to be remotely spooky. The first episode of the DLC ended with a fight against a monster made of televisions, and that was great, but this is a head-scratcher. But less frustrating than the softness of the end generally. At last, Alan is reunited with himself and becomes whole again, But he immediately begins a new novel called The Return. It's a hopeful and triumphant note, but so frustratingly neat and convenient. It doesn't seem like Alan actually learned much from his experience. It feels like he's just super excited to do more flashlight-driven shooting now that he's validated himself and put his mind back together. Which is pretty much exactly the case. Alan Wake's American Nightmare is not exactly a sequel. It was a short, budget-priced, budget-production follow-up to the original, but it doesn't seem canonical at all. American Nightmare is, hands down, one of the most bizarre official follow-ups I've ever seen to a self-serious original title. American Nightmare isn't really a horror game at all. It's an arcade arena playground for Alan Wake's admittedly satisfying combat mechanics. It's hard to know where to even start with the game, but most people start with the Kasabian CD, so I suppose I will too. American Nightmare's only got 3 levels, but you have to do each level 3 times, caught in a time loop where you have to do incrementally better at rescuing 3 women. To complete each level, you have to match the details of a scene to how it is in Alan's manuscript, but the details of that scene are always trivial and bizarre. The first level, a desert diner and motel, has its manuscript describe a scene where a nearby oil derrick with ghosts coming out of it, don't ask, has to A, have an open valve leaking oil, B, have a series of blinking lights on a switchboard, and C, have a compact disc of mid-2000s band Kasabian playing their hit song Clubfoot. When this is complete, a satellite will be knocked out of orbit and come crashing down on the derrick, blowing it up while that song plays in the background, even after the CD player is destroyed, because Clubfoot is just that great of a track. Or some damn thing. You do this not once, but 3 times. 3 times in this 4-hour game, you watch a satellite conveniently crash into the thing you're trying to destroy, while one of the most goddamn ridiculous songs blares in the background. What's the point of all this, I hear you ask, and, well, I haven't got any more answers than you do. Alan Wake's American Nightmare might either be one of the most singularly nonsensical and bad stories I've ever seen, or it might be a scathing critique of Alan Wake the character's imagination and writing abilities. It could legitimately be either. I can't tell. I've thought about it for hours, and I cannot make up my mind whether this game is pulling my leg or having a seizure. You see, Alan Wake the writer's first gig was a Twilight Zone ripoff called Night Springs, episodes of which are tucked into the original game's levels. They're actually very fun little 90-second horror vignettes. I don't usually watch a game's television if they put it in, but I did watch those. They're all better than American Nightmare. But American Nightmare is framed as an episode of Night Springs. Alan explains that by putting the fictional town in Arizona, he could come through to real Arizona, right? Except, he's got a demonic double, an honest-to-God evil twin on the outside named Mr. Scratch, who's turned out to be quite the serial killer, and that guy has him trapped here in the time loop. Alan says this is a reworking of an episode he wrote called The Champion of Light. So let's look at this. You've got a writer, trapped in his own imagination, who, when given control over writing reality, regresses to his most juvenile work and steals from it. You've got self-consciously stiff and awkward dialogue, and 3 obvious damsels in distress for Alan Wake, the big hero, to rescue. It all seems like the game is just titled wrong, but I suppose Alan Wake's narcissistic daydream is altogether not very marketable. So the game makes it pretty plain that this is all a figment of Wake's imagination, and then goes further to suggest that Alan's doing little with his powers but writing low-effort, self-serving schlock. The only other explanation here is that the entire game's writing team scribbled the story on bar napkins while uproariously drunk, but I'd certainly like to give them all the benefit of the doubt on that one. But what do you do with a bargain sequel that puts in an arena fight with what sounds like 80s hair metal playing in the background, combat beginning and ending with the song? Or another musical fight to a song whose main lyrics are, "I'm a psycho, yeah, I'm such a psycho!" Or puts in a 60-second video clip of your evil twin dancing around with a kitchen knife to that song in some anonymous motel room. There is no active attempt to build any kind of tension, or do any kind of scares, or even do anything fundamentally clever with Alan. The supporting cast feel like they came straight out of a House of the Dead arcade cabinet. There's no interaction Alan has with them that isn't tedious and weird. Yet the game even calls attention to the fact that Alan wrote in 3 separate damsels in distress for him to save. Isn't that a little too much, even for schlocky Alan Wake? And that's the thing. It doesn't feel like a nightmare, it feels like a daydream, where you give yourself a cape and you always come out on top. Mr. Scratch, even though he was introduced in the main game, feels like a bigger idiot than Alan ever was in his entire character arc. It's impossible to believe any of it. Pointless to become invested in self-congratulatory nonsense that is explicit about being self-congratulatory nonsense. If you doubt that it's nonsense, just wait until Alan says, "Good to finally go full auto," when he gets a submachine gun. What's more is that each level is an incredibly deliberate arcade-style arena with weapons you unlock when you find enough manuscript pages. Playing through successively more difficult versions of each level's encounters, unlocking new crates, it's an open-world approach that takes away from, and renders boring, the feeling of oppressive wilderness in the original game. It's quite a thing that even though these levels are now finally big enough to become slightly lost in, they don't even feel an ounce as confusing or vast as the linear paths of the original game. It's all about presentation and tone for making a horror product, and American Nightmare is so purposefully cheesy about presentation and tone in those areas that there isn't a shred of suspense or horror or even anxiety to be found in the whole fucking game. And open-world Alan Wake is something full of fantastic possibility, but this execution is a total waste of that entire stack of potential. Alan Wake's written himself into a corner. At the end of American Nightmare, Alan's triumphant over his enemy and reunited with his wife in a literal drive-in movie ending. The game suggests again that this is all a dream, that things might be different for an Alan Wake 2, but there never was an Alan Wake 2, and there probably never will be. The survival horror genre marches on, though, and Alan Wake isn't the only game on the market where the imagination is the source of all the trouble, where dreams and stories shape the physical world. There's also The Evil Within. Aesthetically, they're almost opposites. The Evil Within has its main character face-deep in a pool of blood and viscera before 5 minutes of the game even pass, but the foundation of horror between this and Alan Wake is the same. This time is a little more hokey around the edges, though. An evil corporation hires an evil scientist who hires an even better but way crazier evil scientist to make a machine that links brains together into a collaborative consciousness. Evil Scientist 1 betrays the smarter and more dangerous Evil Scientist 2, and then uses his brain in a jar as the machine's main world builder. Detective Sebastian Castellanos, his partner Joseph, and their trainee Julie Kidman all end up being plugged into the machine. Without their knowledge, of course. But the game is so much more interesting if you know the frame. The succession of levels as they are feel disconnected and almost random, almost like a systematic checking off of horror environments and tropes. Let's see, you start with the chainsaw man in the industrial place, you move on to the zombie village, you throw in a little cathedral graveyard, and how about a haunted manor on top? But it's all perfectly lucid once you know that this is all going on inside the head of some guy named Ruben. Ruben, who goes by the theoretically more sinister Ruvik now, wasn't always evil, but he sure did get that way later on, and each level is a twisted, labyrinthine path through either an aspect of Ruben's imaginative fantasies about himself, or some of his memories. It's valid to have discovering that be part of Sebastian's arc, but for the player, it only serves to make the game feel exceptionally vague for most of it. Messy. But, like I said earlier, being messy is a huge part of actually building the feeling of being in a dream, of being that one on-shifting dot on a swirling map of thoughts and memories. In that, The Evil Within succeeds. There's a lot of phenomenal integration of classic horror tropes with specific plot points as well, like the importance of fire. Ruben is scarred from a childhood incident where some farmers, wronged by his family, burned down the barn that he and his sister are playing in. His sister died. His burns never went away. These zombies in the village you fight through at the beginning, they aren't actually zombies. They're how Ruben sees, how he remembers the villagers who killed his sister. They're twisted, angry, broken things made of barbed wire and pain. Often they'll just get right back up again after you shoot them until you light a match and burn them. Ruben is afraid of fire. He's hateful at the memory of it. So you douse his creations in flame and they go down for good. His sister's in the nightmare too, or his memory of her. To Ruben, she's a vengeful tangle of limbs and hair. She behaves with the inarticulate rage that Ruben feels about her death. In this dream, Ruben's dream, she's almost completely indestructible, impossibly tough, and returns again and again to make you suffer for the injustices of a past that isn't even your own. Sure, monsters being weak to fire goes back at least to Frankenstein, and probably to the dawn of time, but it's such a tidy justification for its significance in the game that it really resonates strongly. And that's the thing about The Evil Within. Sometimes you think this game knows exactly what it's doing. And then it has a giant spider chase you as you flee on a city bus. The Evil Within has a very specific design pedigree, one that I'm sorry to say that I'm just not very familiar with as a person who never really had any consoles growing up. Its creator is Shinji Mikami, who was the brain behind the very first Resident Evil game, and the equally classic fourth Resident Evil game. Those games, paired with others like Silent Hill, are really the ones that laid down the blueprint for the survival horror genre, the way Deus Ex or Thief set the template for the immersive sim. But Resident Evil is something I never really played in any iteration at all, so while there's an interesting aspect here of a genre pioneer coming back for a modern take on its classic design priorities, I'm really only able to take The Evil Within for what it is right now. And what it is absolutely feels like something from an earlier, more gameplay-centric era. Its characters are paper-thin in their development and look absolutely comical on top of it. I mean, this American Everytown is called Crimson with a K City, and its police department's priority squad car contains a grizzled cliché in a trench coat, a young woman with tight jeans and a dark secret, and a fastidious young detective who wears suspenders and gloves to a homicide scene. They're all preposterous, but the game plays it straight, and ultimately the cast is immaterial to the strengths of the game. Although it's helpful that Alan Wake's plot and script is so complementary to its gameplay, The Evil Within puts enough thought into the moment-to-moment horror of its levels that it can get along fine without it. Like Alan Wake, it understands that above all, a horror game should truly threaten its player, that the player must be weaker and smaller than the creatures hunting them. The survival mechanics come from scarcity. Sure, you can move forward, but only with just enough to make it through an encounter without dying. Use too many bullets here, and they won't be there when you really need them, and then your whole face gets ripped off. This is standard for the subgenre, but the balance is really especially excellent in this game, even if it's got funny anachronisms like smashing crates for glittering prizes. The Evil Within completely eschews the boring and indistinct monster design of something like Alan Wake for a kind of horror that provokes unease because you can't help but look at it, especially when it's looking back at you. The designs of even the most simple monsters are expressively grotesque, and almost every level you'll encounter a larger and often indestructible horror that you've got to run from. Fight, flight, you don't really get to choose, you're going to have to use tons of both. Having recently played Outlast, I was interested to see how much better the encounter design was in this game, even the sequences where you're as defenseless as in Outlast, and when your escapes are just as choreographed. Here, the alternation between being able to defend yourself from things close to your size and then being powerless against a twisting anemone of human limbs a couple hallways down the line makes those moments of powerlessness feel much more terrifying. The inconsistency of the encounters, like throwing two different boss creatures at you in a single level, breeds anxiety and dread. Even if the specifics of the horror are kind of rote and generic, the structure on which the scares are arrayed is pretty sophisticated. Alan Wake used genre tropes and cliches to telegraph itself to attentive players. The Evil Within uses them more straightforwardly, but it also uses them way more aggressively and less immediately predictably, and that makes them feel fresh as well. I'm a fan of Dead Space, another very similar third-person survival horror game, and these monster designs stack right up there with it. But the relentless pace of one disconnected moment of horror after another begins to diminish the power of an individual monster over time. Even Sebastian seems to agree, responding to each fresh hell with an irritated grunt. Balance is by far the trickiest thing to pull off in a horror game like this, where you aren't perpetually defenseless. I played through some of the game on its default difficulty before deciding that I'd like to move through the game a bit faster and then bump down to easy. And yet the game was still extremely tense. Evan Narciss, who reviewed the game for Kotaku, played at a high difficulty and took 30 hours to finish the game, with a total of 140 deaths. I took 20 hours and only died 79 times on the easier setting. The difference in completion time for the game is kind of astounding. I don't doubt for a second that almost that entire extra 10 hours of Evan's playthrough was trial and error that ended up being error. I explored every nook and cranny of the game world that I cared to, and I was actually quite satisfied with the game's length and pacing. I died a lot, 79 times is a hefty heap of getting disemboweled. Yet, I'm pretty sure Evan is, overall, much sharper and much quicker at the gameplay than I am, and he still died nearly twice as many times. And as in his review, that factored negatively. The extra 10 hours of failure states weren't ultimately that complimentary to the experience for him. When a game is so punishing that you're reloading your save every 30 to 60 seconds, often by that point, you're only thinking of the game in terms of objects in a room that you have to avoid or shoot. You hyper-focus on timing a segment and just getting to the next save point, and you lose the value of the context, the art, the atmosphere. When you're stuck on the same hallway for an hour or more, that hallway is no longer very horrifying. It's rote. It's familiar. This game gave me some wonderful scares. It made me anxious. It gave me those moments of dread and doubt and scrappy triumph that I want from a survival horror title, and I got all that on the setting the game says is for spineless cowards. So, go figure. But this experience varies so widely from person to person. You take someone who's got all sorts of fancy reflexes in their thumbs, and they'd probably find the setting that I found compelling to be a total cakewalk. For them, the higher settings are necessary for creating the right level of tension to make the horror work. But the game works either way. You ratchet things up to be tighter and more dangerous, where each mistake is fatal, or you ratchet them down, so that you spend less time getting things exactly right, and more time simply traveling along the experience. Horror is different things to different people, and a whole number of factors have to come together to produce the right cocktail of emotions for the genre experience. By making certain things malleable for differences in the audience, the horror becomes more broadly accessible, more universal, by fracturing the presentation. I've seen people play Bloodborne, and I've seen people love Bloodborne, but when I had an opportunity to play it myself, I spent 4 hours on the first level with no progress. I eventually had an encyclopedic knowledge of exactly where each enemy was in the first 20 minutes of the game, and when they would jump out, but I never found the coordination to do anything meaningful with the knowledge. For that first 20 minutes, I felt the tension, I fell in love with the atmosphere, but Bloodborne is not a good horror title for me, because horror is not the emotional experience I get from it. Frustration is. Pure mechanical frustration. After 4 hours with Bloodborne, I felt the same as I do after 4 hours trying to get a rusted bolt unstuck from my bus, all busted knuckles and boiling rage. The Evil Within's got that same ambition towards extreme severity, and on the higher difficulty levels, it certainly won't tolerate a single thoughtless step. But all those systems still sing their song of violence and fear just as loud and just as lovely if a moment's inattention doesn't produce a game over scream. While I'm sure plenty see it as a poor compromise to sacrifice danger for momentum in the pacing, it led to me enjoying the game a lot more than other reviewers who became mired by the game's mechanical cruelty and the repetitive hours that cruelty adds to the experience. The game's deliberately vague dreaminess is a major factor in making the repetition of death after death after death after death after death so exhausting. You don't know why you were where you just were, you're not sure where you are now, and there's nothing to meaningfully indicate where you're going next. And this goes on for a long-ass time, 20 to 30 hours of an almost completely linear journey. If you can just keep the dreamscape rolling along, it works, but it surely does feel strange to move, say, immediately from a hugely tense, stealth-oriented boss fight in an underground maze of fire and rust to suddenly pop out on a rural hillside and have a prolonged gunfight through what seems like a dilapidated English garden, complete with faux Roman ruins. The hard-stop mission-complete screens aren't really helpful to combating this because they just emphasize that each hour or so of gameplay is, in fact, disconnected from the previous hour and the next hour. No one tells you until 2/3 through the game that these are someone else's dreams and memories. In this, it feels old school in a negative way. It used to be the games were more deliberately broken up this way, but it makes less sense here than for a purely action-oriented game. Think about, say, Duke Nukem vs. Half-Life. One wants you to be aware of each level as a discrete play space with its own secrets and challenges. The other still has those things, but avoids mentioning it at all to preserve immersion. It stops the flow of the experience to say, hey, good job of the game, man. The Evil Within doesn't really see itself as an arcade title, but it does have more than a few of these arcade elements that are blatantly artificial and call attention to the narrative of player versus game instead of the narrative of protagonist versus plot. When you throw in all those deaths for often arbitrary reasons of mistimed button mashing, that feeling of trying to beat the game comes through much stronger than the carefully cultivated feelings of dread and anxiety that make the horror work in a more general kind of way. Artificiality is anathema to horror because it puts what can and can't happen in the smallest of boxes. Let's revisit the Stephen King quote from the opening of Alan Wake, where King said, "Nightmares exist out of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear." Well, games are nothing but logic. Everything must mathematically follow. Nothing exists that wasn't programmed in. There is no actual spontaneity, just the painstakingly crafted illusion of it. When you've played an encounter 10 times, when you've memorized an enemy's attack patterns and know all its tells, well, this explains the horror more meticulously than any exposition ever could. It's like going through a haunted house so many times, you come to find out the guy with the chainsaw's name is Dave, and he's a yoga instructor when it isn't Halloween. When Laura, the sister creature that's all limbs and hair, first appeared, I was goddamn terrified of it, and I stayed terrified all the way up until its final appearance in a boss battle when I became stuck on the battle. I died fully 30 of my 79 deaths right then. It's a multi-stage process where you shoot 3 valves, drop down a level, and then go around shooting and cranking more valves as Laura creeps up behind you for a murderin'. Theoretically, it seems like you ought to be able to defeat the Laura creature. The loading slides say she can be killed, and there's an achievement for doing so. I spent almost 2 hours trying to fry the monster, and I couldn't, so I gave up. Which is nice, even having the option to run away and give up without delivering the killing blow, if you do the valves right without dying. But by the time that whole experience was over, Laura was not remotely horrifying to me. I thought of her in terms of logic and navigation and timing, reach, movement speed. To even get the valves right, let alone roast the monster, I had to begin ignoring the impulses that were tripping me up. My impulses of fear. I don't want to be near a monster. I startle at its approach, I run from it, or else I turn around and I fire round after round into it to try to put it down before it reaches me. Here, you can't do either. You've got to do an environmental puzzle, and that takes priority. Horror is lost when you're managing the situation and not simply reacting to it, because the truth is that the player has always had total control over the situation. They can try again and again and again, and eventually they'll get it, even if what they're trying to do is wicked difficult, or else they just stop and then go about the rest of their lives. The truth is that the danger was always artificial and false. The better encounters in the game try to make you forget that, but the lesser of them end up elevating that boring mood killer of a fact to the forefront of your mind. The wider the levels are, the less you feel the artificiality of them. If there's just one hallway and just one door, you run out of ideas of what to do with them pretty quick. Then it becomes just a matter of get it right or don't. But for every level of the evil within that's strictly trial and error, there's one with a more open and meandering design. In terms of complexity and scale, it's hard to beat the third chapter, actually. It's a whole neighborhood of a pastoral town from Reuben's past, full of traps and too many enemies. It's also where, one by one, you piece together your main arsenal for the rest of the game. In a lot of ways, it is a tutorial arena, meant to learn you a lot of lessons, both triumphant and harsh in short order, but it's such a tight, well-considered little map that it really sticks out. Even though I died there many times trying to get my bearings, and there was always a new approach that I hadn't actually considered yet to try. And when I left, I had all the skills that I needed to press on and actually beat the game. Yet, going forward, there's hardly a level as open as the third. Many of them leave you with the impression that they're open, and quite a few of them have wide-open vistas, especially toward the end. But in terms of creative space, the game really peaks by its third hour. The only real return to that form is in the fantastic 9th chapter, where you visit the manor that Reuben grew up in and eventually claimed for himself when he murdered his parents. It's filled with a satisfyingly macabre backstory that is so endearingly cheeseball that it ought to be narrated by Vincent Price, except, what with him being dead and all. It's also got a bloodlock that requires you to visit 3 wings of the manor house in any order you choose. Occasionally, Reuben himself will appear for a time, and then all you can do is hide. There's a permanent save point in the foyer, but otherwise, the whole manor is dark, dangerous, and at your disposal. There had been so few concrete answers up to this point about the goings-on of the plot that it is a real delight to get so much exposition delivered in such a free-form and self-determined way. Once the 3 wings are complete, you enter the depths of the house for even more exposition and even greater dangers. And it's here you eventually open the door on a field of sunflowers in the farmhouse where Reuben and his sister burned. It's a visually striking moment of the game, and it's honestly too bad that there aren't more diversions of memory like the sunflower field. Reuben's given more character development than any other character by a good margin, and while he is 100% a serial killer with fantasies of blood and barbed wire, there's gotta be more in there that's aspirational, that's peaceful. It would have been thematically powerful to see a struggle between Reuben's different impulses in the environmental design, and would have allowed for a more creative range than the relentlessly moody and gory mindscape of a pure villain. There are some fantastic images of unsettling things within the game, like a canyon of doll parts and a maze of concrete and viscera with eyeball spotlights roving back and forth. But there are more generic destroyed cityscape moments and anonymous industrial tunnels than there are surprising and shocking moments of spectacle. Which is too bad. If this is truly a dream, then the sky shouldn't even be a limit anymore. The later hours of The Evil Within are, to put it lightly though, a crazy atonal mess. This is where the giant spider on the city bus comes into play. The least sensical part of the game is this, where all the Crimson PD folks find themselves suddenly trying to get back to the Beacon Mental Hospital where everything began, after having moved farther and farther away from it through the dreamscape, which also changed their position in the city somehow, which is also part of the dream? Question mark? The DLC provides some specific and helpful answers, but when you're actually playing the main campaign, there's a lot that seems like it's flying completely by the seat of its pants. So you end up spending a huge amount of time doing things like avoiding shark creatures in a flooded street, or puzzling your way across toppled buildings, or running over zombies with the aforementioned bus. The mechanical focus shifts away farther towards combat than evasion, and it skips whole chapters without a boss fight. It simply doesn't feel scary or oppressive or even unpredictable anymore in these segments. It just becomes a Sci-Fi Channel original movie-style cheese fest there for a minute, and really there's nothing to be done about it. Visually, it produces some fun moments. Supernatural Apocalypse is pretty dependable for looking cool at the very least. A string of commuter train cars forming a bridge between two collapsed buildings was a hell of a dramatic vista when you get to it. But it's all pretty immaterial to the aesthetic presented so far, and immaterial to the major themes of the plot. And your final confrontation with Ruben takes a wild turn for the ridiculous as soon as you're done running. The climax is really emblematic of the best and worst of what the evil within has to offer. First, you reach the STEM machine where everyone's minds are connected. It's the machine in a mundane way, but it shifts and becomes this tortured brain sculpture that's appeared several times so far. Ruben consumes one of the supporting cast and becomes huge. You outrun his enormous claws as they rake down the landscape at you. That's fine. It's good. It's imaginative, and it looks spectacular. But then you're flung through the air, and you catch onto a military Humvee, and then use the Humvee's machine gun to shoot Ruben's hands. Ruben shakes you off and impales you on a spike. This is frustrating for Sebastian, so grabs a nearby rocket launcher and then fires missiles at the boss till he dies. Dead serious, that's how you do him, with rockets and a machine gun. So on the one hand, you've got this tremendous visual creativity and the limitless potential of a self-consciously imaginary landscape. On the other hand, you've got an execution rooted in some of the most boring gameplay cliches of them all, like the one that says the player only really feels powerful when they're having a pew-pew-pew explosive blowout action climax. Simply getting out of STEM would have been enough for Sebastian. I really didn't need the rocket launchers on top. And it is such a wildly ridiculous waste of the premise. You're in the limitless mindscape of a brilliant murderer, and the way you end up defeating him is with conveniently placed military hardware. After all the nonsense the player puts up with to get here, you'd think they'd give you something sincere. Nah. After all the horror in this survival horror title, it ends on rote and derivative action. Tone is a fragile thing in a horror game, but the Evil Within's DLC shows a mastery of tone that makes this tone-deaf finale especially confusing and frustrating. The assignment and the consequence form a two-part side story where you follow Kidman's path through the main game's timeline pretty much from start to finish. Although it begins and ends and constantly intersects Sebastian's story, it's only 4 to 6 hours instead of 20 to 30, and it features almost no gunplay, saving combat to complement beats in the story and choreographed ambushes in the environment. It's mostly all about stealth, pretty much dependent on trial-and-error gameplay that drew so much ire in people's experience of the main game. And yet, here, it works so much better. It provides an almost encyclopedic list of answers to the main game's lingering questions. It uses the idea of a subjective, shifting dreamscape more creatively, giving Kidman a struggle that's much more influenced by her personal demons than by Ruben's. A lot of this comes from the fact that Kidman's treated as a whole person with a past in a way that's a lot more comprehensive than what the main game did with Sebastian, despite being so much shorter. Sebastian's journey was reactive, forward-moving. The environment reflected Ruben's world and his history. But Kidman's experience in STEM is derived in large part from her private memories and fears. Kidman works for Mobius, you see, the shadowy corporation that funded the machine, and is largely responsible for the trouble going on. But they recruited her young, pulling her out of a life of poverty and crime and giving her a job that grew and challenged her natural talents. Mobius did well by her. Her being a company woman is one of the late-game revelations in the main campaign, but there it's slotted into the urban segment, and it feels like just one more pointless diversion during that whole uninspired slog. Here, though, that scene that felt devoid of context and setup now actually makes perfect sense. Much about Sebastian's journey does. One of the most frustrating holes is that, while at the end of the game everyone's hooked up to the machine, there's no explanation for when or how that happened. Here, Kidman asks the same question, but gets an answer in a remembered conversation with her faceless boss. The machine! It's wireless. Everyone was connected to the system while they were still in the squad car. While this still doesn't answer how they got upstairs and into the bathtub things, I appreciated at least a token response to this question. The DLC also pivots events and characters toward the sequel, which builds considerably from the themes and events in this extra content, almost more so than the main game. It's peculiar to see so much effort going into content, and more importantly context, that so few people will play. Almost across the board for most games of most genres, it seems like barely more than 10% of players play DLC if achievement tracking is to be believed. With The Evil Within on Steam, it's 5.5% of players for the assignment, 4.7% for the consequence, and a paltry 4.4% for the more tangential executioner level. I feel like The Evil Within is a much more vague and frustrating thing without the DLC. The assignment and the consequence form what's basically a hidden skeleton for the plot of the game, the deliberate structure of the experience that seems so meandering in Sebastian's story. Like Alan Wake's DLC, they allow the game to intensify and more thoroughly explore its core themes. But I wonder at the wisdom of splitting off Kidman's story as side content when it's so critical to the franchise as a whole. When I was a lot poorer a few years back, I hated DLC because I could never afford it. I felt left out and left behind by the content. As a critic, now, I love it a lot more because it often shows alternate takes on the design sensibilities of the core game that put those decisions into sharper relief. It's fun, for me, to think about. But I've got to acknowledge that it's more than a little unfair to ask for more money to explain what the hell is going on in your game's story, to give it context that's almost necessary to see the big picture of the strange central idea. Side stories, expansions, that's one thing. But The Evil Within just feels flat out incomplete without its DLC. Kidman's version of events is about half revisiting locations from the main campaign from different angles, and about half revisiting Kidman's corporate memories of Mobius. That sounds a little boring, but it's done in such a compact, fast-paced way that it never stays with anything long enough for it to feel truly boring or stifling. The thing is, Mobius is absolutely, 100%, an evil thing to work for, and Kidman's done a lot to try to minimize that in her mind. She is grateful for the life she's been given, one where her talent is recognized, but she does know, deep down, that everything she's doing is corrupt, built on predatory lies and greed. So her environment reflects that. The hallways that were once important to her, where she felt important, are now rusted and abandoned. Kidman walks them alone, because the truth is that none of the people she trusted there really had her back. So you get a few of Ruben's monsters and some of his dreams and memories, but only to reunite with the other Crimson PD fellas for their parts of the main game and the stories where they intersect. When Sebastian becomes separated from her again, Kidman wanders into some part of the dreamscape that's personal to her. It makes me wonder if any part of the main game was Sebastian's doing. Was the crumbling city his mind? Was that Sebastian's fear of, too much damn crime in his city manifest as a bus-chasing spider? Hard to say. Sebastian was such a non-character and a blank slate that it's really hard to tell anything about him. With this kind of world building, the better you know the characters in control of the dream, the more interesting the dream becomes. Even the way you save the game in the DLC has personality. Scattered leather couches with a black cat wearing a red ribbon. It's such a small thing, a cat and a couch, yet it acts as an oasis of personal comfort and sanity for Kidman amidst the oppressive chaos, just like the cones of light in Alan Wake. These two DLC are full of touches like that. With a few exceptions, the monsters and puzzles are all excellent as well, as good as the main game, sometimes maybe even a little better. While it's still a completely linear experience with no open approach sequences at all, it's much tighter and more considered in its level design than the main game is with its linear sequences. Familiar mechanics are given new weight, like the axe. Unlike Sebastian, Kidman doesn't have the option to stealth kill everything. You only get to do it when you have an axe, and then once per axe. And you can't axe anyone from the front like Sebastian can. If there are two enemies and one axe, you have to choose, and then sneak up from behind. It makes the combat much more like a puzzle this way. Less reactive, less fast, but more tense, because mistiming or misunderstanding the situation inevitably ends in death. This difficulty is locked in at survival, the middle setting. But that's fine. With fewer enemies and slower play, I was experiencing about the same amount of tension as I did on the lower difficulty of the main game. The monsters are another real standout, more specifically, a spotlight monster that seems to represent the blind devotion that Kidman has to Mobius's orders. It's got a woman's legs on the bottom, a spotlight on the top, and nothing in the middle but teeth, teeth, teeth. It's looking for Leslie, like Kidman, and anything that is not Leslie gets eaten. More than once, a powerful monster in your path gets completely chomped out of the way for you. And there are great climactic sequences where you have to avoid the monster's gaze while waiting for an elevator. Like the famous Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2, grotesquerie is just better when you know it's personal somehow to the person being pursued. It's also an opportunity to try out some mechanics that might not work for a longer, more drawn-out experience. Like the glow sticks. At one point in The Consequence, Kidman loses her flashlight and has to rely on a bottomless bag of little green chemical flares. You can only have 3 flares going at any one time, so rather than a cone of light showing you the way, you get these weak puddles that can't possibly illuminate the whole area. It's a great mix of control and helplessness. Put them anywhere you want, but they're never totally effective. The half an hour or so you spend with the chemical flares is fun, but the green glow is too neon to consistently work with the game's dour earth tone color scheme. It's not a game-long kind of deal, even as an option. But as a shorter, more scripted experience, the DLC feels free to add or remove items from the player as its own moods and ambitions dictate. You'll have the pistol for a little while, trapped under a pile of rubble, and then it will conveniently run out of bullets right at the correct time for the narrative. You'll get the pistol back for a little while in the destroyed city for an every headshot counts segment, and then later on the game will give you a shotgun, but not like the one Sebastian had. You get a dinky little one-shot. But coming right at the end of the DLC as it does, it feels like a goddamn cannon. After being so powerless for so long, the limitations of the one-shot then reload format seems totally workable. But they limit you from really approaching a combat situation in a frontal way. If you can't do the job with a single shot, God help you. And for a lengthy pre-finale bit, the enemies just keep coming. You never have enough ammunition to stop them. You just have to pick your shots and cleave a path through them and escape. The game is seriously good at making running away feel exhilarating, chasing both Sebastian and Kidman with gigantic and terrifying hulks of madness, forcing them down long corridors and tight turns with the claws of death right behind them. Kidman is haunted by her boss, or her perception of her boss, as a dark and demanding shadow who grows more and more murderously displeased with Kidman's performance in the stem. At first, it seems like he's the real deal, actually communicating with Kidman from the outside, but as things go on, he starts criticizing more and more personal things about Kidman, and growing more and more supernaturally menacing, until finally he becomes the largest and strongest of the monsters pursuing you. Kidman's fear of failure, her fear that she was never good enough, her worry that she gave up her soul for the company, conquering those fears is essentially the climax. Kidman's climax and boss fight is infinitely better than Sebastian's, connected as it is to the more imaginative possibilities of the environment and to Kidman's own story arc. It feels right, it feels truly climactic, and it looks amazing. It's an abstract and impossible environment with an unsettling monster dead in the center. While The Evil Within is most certainly a horror title, it wasn't able to maintain horror consistently across its somewhat bloated length. The assignment and the consequence can and do. They illustrate why sometimes short stories and vignettes are more frightening than long novels and movies when it comes to horror. A smaller, shorter, meaner piece often cuts deeper than a thing trying to split its thematic attention. The final piece of DLC, The Executioner, is a funny bit of content in a lot of ways. It, combined with the epilogue of The Consequence, set up Sebastian's wife Myra as a major character for the next game, right down to her working for Mobius and her large pearl earrings. It also humanizes some of the monsters in the main campaign, showing that there were actual minds behind some of the largest and most grotesque of the main game's creatures. You play here in this DLC as the Keeper, the fellow with a safe for a head, who would come back from the dead again and again in the main campaign. The Executioner has a completely different mechanical approach than anything in the main game, though. It's a first-person, melee-focused combat brawler. You visit the Manor House from Chapter 9, but with new extensions and additions. There are other people trapped in here that Mobius wants dead, and if you succeed in tenderizing the living fuck out of them with your big meat hammer, your daughter, who is also plugged into the machine, won't lose her memories and won't lose her sanity and become lost in the nightmare. It subverts the whole survival horror aspect. You're much more powerful than your foes, and you can tear a dozen of them apart in just a few bloody seconds. You have a somewhat ridiculous upgrade currency to make you even more dangerous. You even have a chainsaw and Molotov cocktails by the end of it. So where's the horror? Well, what you've got instead is dread. You're playing a monster who is increasingly aware of how doomed he is, and the final boss fight is actually against yourself in a fit of self-annihilation. The deeper you go, the farther away your daughter gets. It becomes obvious that Mobius never had any intention of doing anything other than treating you and your daughter like lab rats. And after 2 major narratives about powerless characters who eventually triumph, we've got a little short one about a powerful character who can never and will never triumph. There's still horror being accomplished through the powerlessness of his position, drifting deeper into the nightmare. Like throwing a knight into a lake. Yes, they're big, yes, they're strong, but you know they're just going to drown. And there's a real melancholy there, despite the evil corporation cheese. And then there's the gore, of course. The Evil Within is all about gore, just heaps and buckets of it, with intestines for streamers and skulls for juggling. Every bit of it leverages extreme and grotesque imagery for all it's worth. And it's worth a lot. Games are so obviously artificial that they can make gore a huge part of the world and not seem as off-putting or cheap as movies might. Makeup on humans is hard to make convincing. An artistically consistent world of seeping wounds and barbed wire done up in 3D, though, well, that's something that just feels more natural, easier to suspend disbelief for. Gore alone can certainly be boring, but when you pair it with other tonal priorities that The Evil Within demonstrates, it becomes more than just a red mess. You throw in dread, throw in despair, throw in discomfort, and it elevates the viscera into something more memorable, even if the main point is still squishing zombies with a hammer. I think everyone was caught off guard, though, by how much better The Evil Within 2 does with essentially the same damn setup as The Evil Within 1. It contains, hands down, some of the best horror imagery in gaming, and one of the more satisfying open worlds in an explicitly horror-driven title. It fully realizes the creative possibilities of the nightmare dreamscape and doesn't hold back. At least, not much. The setup for how the dreamscape works is slightly different, with hundreds of connected minds all living in a stable replica of a sleepy rural town. Why? I'm not entirely sure. I suppose so that the people researching the dreamscape have somewhere comparatively normal to cling to. In any case, rather than Reuben as the core, the mind that dictates the dreamscape's primary form, you've got someone more stable and cooperative, keeping the homes and laboratories coherent and fixed. It's, drumroll please, Sebastian Castellanos' daughter, with Myra as her caretaker. Bum bum bum. So when something goes terribly awry inside Union the Mine Town, Julie Kidman shows up at the bar where Sebastian is deepening his cliché and recruits him. You've got to go in again, Sebastian, but this time, it's personal. I think this is a lot why the game was such a surprise, because the setup makes it sound like a straight-to-DVD sequel, like we weren't going to get any more out of The Evil Within 2 than we might out of Cube 2 Hypercube. What it actually feels like, though, is like starting over fresh. The Evil Within 1 might as well be backstory delivered in a journal. From here on out, Sebastian Castellanos is treated as an actual human being, with cobwebs of grief and regret covering up the dream of family he used to have. It's not amazing characterization, it's pretty straightforward, but it's done with a kind of sympathy and weight that makes Sebastian seem like more than a brown trenchcoat mobility system. What's important here is the level design and monster design is now going to be even more closely tied to the characters, to their self-perceptions and their fears. The town of Union is falling apart, breaking into island chunks in the dreamscape. With the lack of cohesion, powerful minds are reshaping the environment to better suit their own whims and egos. But all of that is unpredictably interlaced with the town of Union as it was intended, neighborhood-wide maps with dozens of scares and curiosities. These neighborhood hubs branch off for a few chapters at a time into more linear maps that more closely resemble the Evil Within 1's design sensibilities. Everything that I hoped that Alan Wake's American Nightmare would be, The Evil Within 2 actually is. It's a horror game that knows how to build and maintain tension across an open-world map. It's a game about the imagination that's actually imaginative. And it's a damn good third-person action title on top of it. The game is roughly broken up into 3 parts based on which antagonist is closest to the core, Lily. All the main villains are completely distinct from one another in aesthetic and intention. But there's some other shapers making contributions to the world as well. Sebastian brings in parts of the hospital from last game and a memory of his office at the Crimson Police Department. The office is, surprisingly, exactly as portrayed in the Consequence DLC from last game, cementing the relative importance of that content to the franchise. And then there's the industrial corridors of the Mobius labs interconnecting the whole neighborhood hubs that wouldn't look too many miles off from Bright Falls. The Evil Within 2 benefits a lot from being a sequel and getting to cram the whole setup into the first 45 minutes or so. It begins with so much more narrative context and momentum than its predecessor, which reveled in its teasing vagueness. So Sebastian encounters his first nemesis right off the bat, a deranged photographer who's taken a shine to using the mutability of the dream world to make art out of murder. When he kills folks, he freezes the moment of death in a recurring time loop. They die over and over, the most dramatic spurts and spatters playing and replaying. Now consider how useful this is as a design feature in the game. As the player creeps around looking for items in secret hallways and all the poking at the seams of the game that players engage in from time to time, the macabre thing that the game wants you to look at is always at its dramatic peak from any angle that the player approaches it. Never in life could a haunted house do the same trick. By making the villain a vain and narcissistic psychopath, they've given themselves, as game designers, license to use wildly baroque flourishes that never would have fit in with Angry Ruben's World of Revenge in the first game. The villain here wants you to see what he's doing, all done up in lights for an adoring audience, and whatever Sebastian may think, that's certainly why the player is in here in the first place as well. I thought Stefano, the artist, might be way too over the top when I saw a preview of the game. He's actually just right. His self-absorption is so absolutely huge that his ego is tearing chunks out of the streets. He's a ham. Totally a ham. But the performance is deliberate on that front, and he does come off as sincerely crazy, which is key in making him feeling genuinely menacing. If I was actually in Sebastian's shoes, I would be pretty goddamn wary of this guy. But I'm not. I'm comfortably at home, and so I appreciated the hell out of Stefano's showmanship. Like how Ruben's obsession with traps was important to both plot and gameplay, stylish cruelty becomes important in these first few chapters of the game dealing with Stefano. Under his hand, the town of Union has become a three-ring circus of mutilation and suffering, and you've got to hand it to him for being a really good ringmaster. The staggering of different types of level design and different rhythms of horror is the backbone of The Evil Within 2's success, though. The first chapter is introductory and expositional, the second builds apprehension and throws in some serious horror grotesqueries in a linear space that feels familiar, and then the third chapter. Where in the first game it mostly felt open, here the third chapter is one of two major hub neighborhoods, and it's noticeably the larger of the two. It's a map so enormous and so meticulously crafted that it does a lot of salesmanship for the entire rest of the game, even as the game narrows and narrows the scope of how open it's truly willing to be later on. Points of interest are marked by crackling radio signals, whose signal gets stronger or farther away as you do. It's suitably creepy, but more important is that it's inconsistent in how trivial or challenging a thing you'll find. It generates a kind of thrilling anxiety in wondering which is which. The largest diversions are the ones that form an interesting side plot involving an invincible wraith witch kind of thing that properly haunts, Sebastian for most of the game, but only ever by relative surprise in these optional areas. Each time Sebastian uncovers one of the areas that the Wraith is lurking in, he'll be pulled into his memories of Beacon Asylum from the first game, sometimes in the form of mazes, sometimes puzzle rooms, but always with this spectral nemesis on your tail. After perhaps half a dozen encounters, you evade her and get to the heart of what she was hiding. And it's Sebastian Castellanos himself. His fear that he never left the asylum, his nagging doubt that he never came back to reality in the first place. To a part of him, Beacon was a trauma he could never overcome or outrun, which manifested into a monster with the same definitions. I was immediately reminded of Alan finding himself again in that game's DLC. There, true to that game's tone, it was a peaceful reconciliation. But this is a darker game, and Sebastian snuffs that part of himself out with a bullet to the head. That part of Sebastian will never find rest, so he just sends him on into oblivion, I suppose. But when Sebastian regains himself, he's holding the revolver that he used in the first game, and then that becomes a usable weapon from there on out, bringing back the pinpoint accuracy that gun enjoyed. It's a hell of a side quest. Not only did it have some heft to its thematic impact, but it gives a surprising, delightful gameplay reward to the player for pursuing it. Almost every side quest in the game, and there are only a handful of them, is well worth pursuing for some sort of twist or reward like this. None are as impressive as the Wraith Witch side quest, but there's one as melancholy. There's a technician, Sykes, who's a pretty likable guy. He's in the second major neighborhood hub, and the last time that you help him, he thinks that he's got a way out of STEM, and asks Sebastian to clear all the nightmare creatures out of a hidden laboratory. When you do, he climbs into a tub like the one that Sebastian climbed into to begin with. He waves an intrepid goodbye, and then he disappears into a soft and quiet fog. Then the door opens, with a recording and some prizes behind it. While you're admiring your new shotgun and hoovering up the other valuables in the room, a last-minute revelation comes through. 75% of the time, this tub fails to work and sends you deeper into the dreaming, far below any coherent thought, into madness and nothingness. There's only a 1 in 4 chance that Sykes didn't just damn himself to an even worse hell than everyone's already in. It's that kind of kicker that makes this game so memorable. Sometimes you get the monsters, the screaming, the blood. Sometimes the misery comes in all on tiptoes, quiet, sharp. The alternation between the two, and the game's skill in never tipping its hand too early about which kind of horror you're going to get, is surprisingly masterful. It's the glue that binds the horror together, viscous with anxiety and dread. The world is falling apart rapidly with so much violence and fear and so many competing minds, and that growing instability becomes a source of dread in itself as the game rolls along. Stefano gets sidelined relatively early on in the plot. It seems deeper in because the bulk of the open-world freeform content comes before his death, but in terms of the game's actual narrative attention, his short and fast arc as villain works greatly to his benefit. He keeps topping himself in terms of macabre spectacle. So you've got his ever-watchful camera's eye dominating the skyline, you've got his murder cube compositions, and then you see the Obscura. It's a truly unsettling chimera of model and photographer, literally sewn up together into a kind of flesh crab of agonized and angry skin. There's a little similarity to the Spotlight creature from the last game's DLC, but the way it moves is creepy and distinct in its own way, and it is uniquely awful all on its own merits. Once you've gotten over the sights, and worse maybe the sounds of the thing, you get a tremendous spectacle from Stefano. Stefano gives you a theater full of exploding heads, timed to go off at the exact same moment. It is a rose garden of death. Kinda crazy, kinda impressive. Of course, it's also where Stefano gets his cheesiest line about entering his crimson period of his craft. So he kind of peaks here in terms of both spectacle and believability as a character. And then the boss fight follows immediately afterwards. No lingering, no going further up the scale of ridiculousness than it's appropriate for him to go. And then the game does a great little bit of 3-card Monte with the story to follow. You thought Sebastian's daughter with Stefano, but ho, here's Myra, a monstrous and wrathful version of Myra come to collect her. The zombies are actually all her fault. Anything with the crazy red eyes and white goop is a monster from her particular domain of nightmares. So there's cup number 2. But then the very next chapter puts Myra and Lily far out of reach and introduces yet another villain, a manipulator behind the scenes whose presence had so far only been hinted at, Father Theodore. Now, Theodore is a manipulator in a very direct sense. He preys on other people's insecurities and draws strength from them, fashioning visions and environments designed to hit people where they're most vulnerable. He's quite believable in the role, maybe just as visually over the top as Stefano, but who wouldn't indulge a bit if you could look any way you pleased to imagine yourself? Everyone knew him as a kind of good-natured sort before everything went south. He had kept this part of himself relatively hidden. And he kept it hidden from Sebastian until now as well. But at this point in the game, there's no one around to tell him otherwise, so Theodore has created a pocket world of fire and stone, medieval torture and medieval penitence. It's actually kind of amazing to see a cult leader type character this way, not as they are, but the self-delusion of who they think they are. They're in the refuge of dreams. They're powerful and dangerous people, even if they're weak and small in real life. Father Theodore uses Sebastian's worry and Sebastian's guilt as actual weapons against him. Even if Sebastian knows that Lily is around here somewhere, he still has years of thinking that he let her die in a fire weighing him down, so that guilt becomes real fire, and the fire burns. Again, it's not like this is amazing or revolutionary writing, but the presentation is so colorful, and the central idea allows for such creative visual representations of airy themes that it seems novel anyway. Unfortunately, the only open-world segment in Father Theodore's part of the game is a rehash of the neighborhood you met Sykes in, but all set on fire and even worse off. It's strange that they chose only to use the Union parts of the dream world in a free-form way like that. There's no reason why they can't have a neighborhood of cinders for Theodore's segment, besides the ever-pesky concerns of, time and money and development. But still, Theodore is a villain who could have done with at least 2 more hours of focus, whose god complex is interesting enough that I wanted much more of his particularly awful definition of heaven. But things go so quick once they get going, and Theo gets relatively shorted. On the one hand, the pacing of this game compared to the last is just insanely fast, and that's welcome. By this point in the last game, you'd just be getting your first concrete answers. Here, you're 2/3 done already. Theo's religion also seems to be part of a larger recurring motif that the franchise hasn't really done much with yet. This strange symbol that you see all over Theodore's domain was also painted on the walls of the Beacon Asylum, and it's the symbol and the cult that prompted Kidman's parents to essentially abandon her, as revealed in the DLC. So there's some kind of mystery there that might find some interesting payoff later in the series, but here, the meaning of that particular symbol is dormant, second to Theodore's cult of personality. His boss fight reminded me a lot of the level in Dead Space 2 where you revisit the Ishimura, all bloodstains turned neon purple by the investigative chemicals. Here, you return to the last game as well to fight 3 major bosses in rapid succession. But here, you triumph in a way that you never did in the first game. The boss fight is actually, deliberately, explicitly therapeutic for Sebastian as a character. He's done feeling guilty. He's done feeling lost. He's here for his goddamn daughter, and he's not gonna take no bullshit monsters, not no more. Sebastian always wanted this catharsis, and now, thanks to Theodore, he's actually getting it. It's a real delight helping him out with the monster smashing, because this is a moment that subverts the horror into a positive moment of triumphant badassery. Like when Ripley appears in the power loader to battle the Queen at the end of Aliens, the hunted decides to stop running, and then the hunter wonders if it hasn't made a terrible mistake, which it has at that particular sort of story beat. It's a really wonderful tone shift, and done at the exact right moment to pivot to a whole new set of emotions that the climax wants to get into. Father Theodore was the last true monster, the last psychopath. But Myra is the last antagonist. Her fierce, overwhelming desire to protect Lily and keep Lily safe will trap them in the dream world forever, in an illusion of family suspended in a dying world, like choosing to live in a snow globe. Sebastian wants them all to come out, to try to be a family again on the outside, where nothing can be controlled like the dreaming can be controlled. And so, in The Evil Within 2's final hours, the game becomes the most high-budget, spectacular domestic dispute in the history of the medium. What makes it work so well is that Sebastian is not portrayed as being hateful or fearful towards Myra, and although Myra has a bit of monstrousness in her now, for sure, Sebastian doesn't move towards the final confrontation as if a monster is necessarily what he'll find there. Throughout the game, Myra actually offers Sebastian little snippets of domestic dreaming and even explicitly forgives him for some of the things he's felt that he couldn't forgive about himself. This is shuffled into the deck with all the other disparate parts of the dreamscape, all the horror and all the dread, and appearing there in these moments of calm didn't really feel out of place. But read the environment now. Theodore sent Sebastian into a dark pit of himself, full of monsters and haze. Sebastian's worst fears of what he's like on the inside, empty except for the fight. But here, everything is a frozen plain, with nothing but the house they once shared together as a normal family far up the hillside. This is the place Myra made for herself. Cold, remote, unchanging, stagnant. Sebastian's interference presents more questions than Myra cares to answer. Stay here, safe, forever. That was the plan. There was no second option to the plan. So, they fight it out, with Myra transforming into a gross and colossal version of herself. I was getting ready to feel like this was kind of a dumb idea for a boss fight, until it made me, quite unexpectedly, very sad. My parents' divorce was about as bitter, drawn out, and acrimonious as it got, and I remember the way they talked about each other, the angry distortions they'd used to try to poison my opinion of the other one. It's not actually so unusual for parents to speak this way of each other, to make monsters of each other. It's just uncommon for those monsters to fight with pistols and machine guns in the middle of the snow. Imagination and perception are powerful and dangerous things. That's why horror media plays around with them so much, makes real and present the kind of awful things we think or feel or say. If my dad was the kind of person my mother described, he would also be a 100-foot-tall slab of withered meat and open sores, inarticulately roaring and pounding the earth. If my mother was the kind of person that my dad experienced her as, she would also be a blind, wrathful creature with no blood and no heart, not on the inside, but blank, unreadable nothing. But of course, they were neither of those things. They were just regular people who couldn't stand the sight of one another. Yet in teasing out the monstrousness of these feelings, by giving them form, by giving them weaknesses and solutions, horror lets us confront and consider them in ways we might not as just a vague feeling. There are no monsters in the Evil Within's universe that are not imaginary, but that does nothing to stop them from being dangerous. So the feeling at the end here, at the final boss, is a fine tightrope between sentiment and grotesquerie. But I've got to admit I feel like they're in balance. Here in the dream world, the grotesquerie is representative of the sentiment. And that's a thing that would struggle to work as well in a medium that didn't have such wild possibilities of presentation and interaction. If anything with the game is unbalanced, it's that The Evil Within 2 is excessively back-heavy with its story. The fight with Myra and the compassionate resolution that follows it was the climax and the conclusion that I was really looking for. But the game wants to tie up the entire fate of the Mobius Corporation before winding down entirely, and that ends up being a bridge too far for the game's already heavily downshifted tone. It's not anything so ridiculous as the final boss fight of the first game, not exactly, but it is a whole extra 45 minutes of cheesy cutscenes and espionage action, as you suddenly begin switching perspectives between Sebastian in the dream and Kidman in the real world. So, at this point, the game's decidedly just done being scary, and wants Mobius out of the way as a future plot point, which is, honestly, admirable. If there's any one element of the franchise holding it back, it's the shadowy suits with dark sunglasses aspect. With Kidman's DLC, it worked because it was personal to her, but in a general kind of way, Mobius is the most cliché and incongruous element of the story. Honestly, I'm surprised that this is even part of the main campaign of Evil Within 2, and not split off into DLC itself. Swapping between Sebastian finally being reunited with his daughter and Kidman having a whack-a-mole shootout with the other company men seems about as cheap as it is unexpected. The whole sequence just can't escape how workmanlike it is, how obvious it is that they're just tearing down the final thing that stands between Sebastian and a happy ending for the game. But again, ultimately, I'm glad of it, because it is a positive step for the franchise. By the game's description, Mobius has agents at all levels of power and influence the world over, a secret private army that knows no boundaries. How does that help a franchise about individual anxieties and self-delusions taking form and substance? I mean, it doesn't. It's just a convenient way to explain the secret brain-linking machines, being a thing. So Myra stays behind in the dream world and becomes the core, using her knowledge from working with Mobius to fry the microchips in everyone's head and kill every member of Mobius the world over simultaneously and immediately. It's pretty tidy. Meanwhile, Kidman needs to extract Sebastian and Lily before they're caught in the same collapse that Myra will be. And yeah, there's some good momentum and some tension, as we see all three of these characters move and build toward the finale, but it's all soundtrack-driven momentum. The feeling comes mostly from editing and the moments where the game chooses to swap perspectives. The game, as we knew it, had been over for a while by the time the credits roll. The game even gives Sebastian a real happy ending, where he gets to literally ride off into the sunset with his daughter. I never cared for Lily's character design. She looks like she escaped from a Precious Moments greeting card, but I'm rooting for Sebastian. He's a person to me now, not a trench coat, and I'm glad he found true self-resolution in the stem this go-around. I mean, hey, this time it really was personal. Of course, there's a cliffhanger suggesting old Reuben might not be done, and to look out for the Evil Within 3, and yet, I liked it this way. This actually does feel like a transitional work, elevating what worked best about the first game and paving the way for a potential third game to express the same themes with even more effectiveness and intensity, without some of the baggage of the first two games' more melodramatic impulses. And why not? There is no end to the diversity and depth of human emotion, no ceiling that the imagination will ever slam fruitlessly against. The mind is a beautiful thing, certainly, but it is terrible, too. Like those old maps of the ocean, we simply draw the waves we see on the surface and say, "Here, there be monsters." Thanks for watching. I want to take a moment and thank by name all the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to support me on Patreon. There's a lot of people who are donating less than that, and I'm grateful to you too, but I've only really got time to list the people who are donating $10 a month or more because that's particularly helpful, and thank you. People like Cassie, Ron Gervais, Comfy Hat, Yala Laszlo, Gabriel Nichols, Christian Zacharianson, Eddie Burton, Soeb Sheik, Will Hooten, Milky Way Resident, Nick Cole Hamilton, Jake Brennan, Daniel Pennypacker, Dennis Clark, Eli Bergmass, Julius Dean, World War II Freak, Alexander Leister, Kumaran Vijian, Alex Forgani, Justin Hughes, Igor Babiuk, Brian Hill, Nobody, Thunder O'Brien, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, Andreas Larson, Kevin Schaub, Anthony Bardill, Peter Flink, Dana Stubkjær, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Zach Korpstein, Matthew Sutton, Jesse Wilkinson, Diller, Alexander Ofodu, Chris Wright, Peter Radevsky, Cy, Hercules Johnson, Andre Bregeger, Sean Weber, Aiden AK-47, Tim Moon, Scott Miller, Kimmo Heikkinen, Medal of Connor, Matthias Hellstrand, Joel Warren, Tim Darney, Tizar Vicarian, Jeffrey Knutson, Mike Downing, Devin Vernon, Kim Winson, Oscar Stengenberg, Tom Painter, Quitch, Luke Murphy, Will Dobbins, Sebastian Pironi, Will Wargrave, Jack Harvey, Carol Henderson, Dice Prophet, William Davis, Jonas Martinson, Jeanette N., Robert Glover, Will Edwards, Kyle Hooten, Jack Dawson, Alex Zelato, Carl Clark, Stephen Garrett Day, Jason T. Barnes, Preston Allen, Clay Harrington, Lori Ramey, Jacob Robertson, Andrew Schiffel, Michael Atwell, Kyle Hooten, Carl Clark, Matthew, Max Wellington, Stephen Podyok, Devin Fitzpatrick, Stephen Primo, Balder Carlson, Pascal Moray, Jack Dawson, Alex Zelato, Brad Carr, Philip Coffey, Joaquin Coleman, Trivium Art History, Cameron Booth, Cheryl De Vera, The Soul James, Ryan Van Dyke, Micah Shalom Kesselman, Nathaniel Garish, Daniel Mower Myrie, Tyle Reich, Ray Sawyer, Sharif Kazemi, Artem Sernow, Rich Stower, Sorcerer Dave, Colby Howard, Joris Middendorp, Andrew Tapp, Caleb Guthrie, Luke Fowler, Nate Williamson, John Vickers, Fergus Foley, Carl Gleason, Eric Jepson, John Paul Harsh, Brandon Boat, Galak, Dewey, Chris Kayan, Sean, N.K. Jemson, Josh Farkas, Greg Mirles, Reference Error, Alex B., Nicholas Atkokaitis, Andy Mitchell, Brad Smith, D-Stex, Colin, Simon Nearfault, Wesley M., Harley McAvoy, Matthew Cassidy, Free Morphine, Argus Swift, Mark Phillips, Clayton, Divyeth Faust, Raider Okoy, Abdul Rahman Alabsi, Daniel Pierning, Aurelian, Brynock, Ricard Olson, Martin Karsten, Chris Larkey, Matthew Mason, Majaflyer, Brian Plockelman, Spyro Sedaris, Pay Sangustin, Ashley Rain, Andre Videla, Anxiety Cat, Lupus Yonderboy, Oten, Casey Pioli, Gumdrops, Rob Tackett, Thomas Whitty, Egan Elbra, Peter Pannier, I Cannot Fly, Brett Gelmo, Yazam Barghouti, Nathan Jansen, Liang Zhao, Thomas Keys, Tim Marsh, Antonio Joseph Dovale III, Alexander Sundin, Dan Pop, Cameron Jackson, Lassalis, Tyler Dowsey, Michael Conan, Dirk Warbrule, Niels Bach-Frummer, Josh Evan Hill, David Carlson, Q-Ray X, Morton Sconning, Rowan King, Zach B., Jordan Clive, Brennan Ritchie, Sean Young, Scorpion Strike, Anthony Galang, Toon Young, Krimger Schleps, Lucas Kokon, Michael Sunenvader, Noah Ford, Dirk Warbrule, Colin Short, Adrian Komale, Avery White, Andrew Boissonneau, Michael Lilladall, Drew, Morgan Mall, Zach Z, Fledzy, and Mark Phillips. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your patience on this video.